Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we respectfully acknowledge that the ground on which we stand are traditional Miami and Shawnee lands. We extend our esteem and gratitude to the indigenous people who call this place home. Welcome to the Harriet Beecher Stowe House lecture series here at the First Unitarian Church and online. We're excited to have you here. My name is Christina Hartley, but I'm the director over at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. Our lecture series sponsors are the Friends of Harriet Beecher Stowe House Board and, of course, the First Unitarian Church here. We have lots of upcoming events, so I recommend you go out to our website and check things out. But we have next Wednesday evening, we have our Voices for Truth discussion series, which will be held at the Walnut Hills Branch Library and online. We have a couple of walking tours scheduled for May. The Abolitionists and African Americans in Walnut Hills is scheduled for Saturday, May 11th at 10 a.m. And our new walking tour, the African American History Along the Riverfront, is scheduled on Saturday, May 18th, also at 10 a.m. Then in June, we have Harriet's birthday party coming up, and that's on Sunday, June 9th. And then look for all of the housewarming, reopening events, which will take place the weekend of July 19th through the 21st. So we're really excited to be able to invite people back into the restored house. So like I said, check out our website, stowehousecincy.org. All right, so today we have the pleasure of having Dr. Matthew Norman. He is Associate Professor of History at the University of Cincinnati Blue Ash. He holds a PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a BA from Knox College. His research interests include, of course, Abraham Lincoln and the United States Civil War. His recent book, Knowing Him by Heart, African Americans on Abraham Lincoln, that we are going to get a glimpse of today, broke new ground in the study of Abraham Lincoln and was recognized with the 2024 Abraham Lincoln Institute Book Award. He co-edited the book with Dr. Fred Lee Hord, one of Norman's former college professors, and the Abraham Lincoln Book Award is a prestigious form of recognition, especially among Lincoln historians. Its recipients over the last 25 years include noted American historians and writers John Meekum and Doris Kearns Goodwin. So we're excited that he's sharing some of the contents and connections with us today. We'll have his presentation and then some time for questions. So let's welcome Dr. Norman.
All right, thank you for that introduction. And do we have the PowerPoint? Okay. Got all kinds of technology going on here, I think. There we go. Okay. Okay, thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And I noticed he'll make a cameo today that this building is dedicated to William Howard Taft. So there will be a few references to Cincinnati in my talk today. But this book that I did with Fred Hord has recently been published by the University of Illinois Press. And you might wonder, do we need another Lincoln book? There have been over 10,000 Lincoln books published since 1865. And since the 1930s, historians have been asking, has the Lincoln theme been exhausted? And each time they've asked that question, they've said, no, it hasn't. And so what I hope to do today is talk a little bit about our book, and I'll share my thoughts on some of my favorite documents from it, okay? But over 10 years ago, Fred Hord, who was my professor, I was in a freshman seminar with him at Knox College back, I won't give you the year, we'll just say it was the last century when I was in his class. And years later, out of the blue, he contacted me. And at the time I was teaching at a college in Pennsylvania, but we still have a home in Galesburg. Knox, by the way, has a lot of interesting connections to Cincinnati and the Lane Seminary and the Stowes. Edward Beecher, Harriet Beecher's brother, was the local minister in Galesburg in the 1850s. And the college was founded by abolitionists from upstate New York. So there's a lot of interesting connections. And they're also very proud of their Lincoln connection. The campus of Knox College was host to the 5th joint debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas in 1858. And in 1860, Knox was the first college to give Abraham Lincoln an honorary degree. So if there's anyone in cyberspace from Knox or Galesburg, there's the plug for Knox College, okay? Trying to get everybody some credit today. But Fred contacted me, and we met, and at the time, Fred was chair of Black Studies at Knox, and he had read some of my writings that I had published on Lincoln, and he proposed that we do a project together. And as a Lincoln scholar, I wondered, well, what could we do that would be new and original and make a contribution? And we were having these meetings, and finally Fred one day said, has anyone ever done a collection of African-American writings on Abraham Lincoln? And I said, no one has. So that was the genesis of our book, okay? And if we can go to the next slide, let's see here. Okay. So on the left there is an image of a letter that a fellow named John Proctor wrote to Abraham Lincoln in April 1863. Proctor was a formerly enslaved person who had recently enlisted in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. And he had been freed by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And he wrote this letter to President Lincoln. It's in the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. And in a previous life, I worked on a project to make all of Lincoln's papers at the Library of Congress available online. And in the course of working on that project, I read every single item in the collection. And there are over 20,000. It was kind of fun. I've got a lifetime of ideas for projects, but this is one of my all-time favorite documents out of all 20,000. Because Proctor did not have the benefit of a formal education. And yet he felt it was important to write to President Lincoln to tell him how grateful he was for the Emancipation Proclamation, because it freed him. And also to tell Lincoln that he was very happy to be in the Army and that he looked forward to perhaps finding his former master and exacting a little bit of revenge on him. Okay? But in this letter, Proctor asked Lincoln to remember him to his fellow citizens of the United States. And so for me, I think this letter encapsulates the revolutionary nature of the Civil War and of the Emancipation Proclamation in particular, because when the war started, Proctor was enslaved. And by 1863, he's a free man wearing a U.S. Army uniform, helping to win this war. And Lincoln gave a lot of credit to the nearly 200,000 black men who wore the U.S. uniform to help win this war. So Proctor admired Lincoln. And in this letter, he also expresses his regret that he'll probably never be able to see Lincoln with his own eyes. Okay? And then the other image is of another item you'll find in our book, and it is from Lerone Bennett Jr. And Lerone Bennett Jr. was an editor for Ebony magazine. He was a historian. And in 1968, he published an article in Ebony with the provocative title, Was Abe Lincoln a White Supremacist? And in Bennett's view, the answer to the question was an emphatic yes. Lincoln was. Bennett argues that Lincoln embodied this, what Bennett referred to as this American tradition of white supremacy. So you have two very different views, one from Proctor, one from Bennett. And in our book, you'll find we've assembled voices from over 150 different people, and that we have over 200 documents that span the time from 1858, the year of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, when Frederick Douglass, not the Douglas that's debating Lincoln in 1858, but Frederick Douglass first took public notice of Abraham Lincoln. And then our book concludes with a speech by President Obama in 2009 that was delivered in Springfield, Illinois on the occasion of the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth. There we go. So how do we account for such diverse views of Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation? In his seminal work, Lincoln and the Negro, published in 1962, the centennial year of Lincoln's preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, Benjamin Quarles, an African-American historian, reminded readers of a statement that Frederick Douglass had made regarding the primacy of Lincoln's place in the consciousness of African Americans. We all know Lincoln by heart, and that's where we got our title from. Okay? Douglass certainly knew Lincoln by heart, yet he either experienced several changes of heart or perhaps he possessed a divided heart. In the immediate wake of Lincoln's assassination, Douglass wrote that Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president. But 11 years later, at the dedication of Thomas Ball's Emancipation Group in Washington, D.C., Douglass referred to Lincoln as preeminently the white man's president and black people as only his stepchildren. Yet in the same speech, Douglass also described Lincoln as a friend and liberator who was near and dear to our hearts. Ball's sculpture epitomizes the image of emancipation as a gift that Lincoln gave to the enslaved and depicts what has been referred to as the Emancipation moment. Lincoln's signing of the final Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, marked the seminal emancipation moment for the United States. African-American views of Lincoln help illuminate a contradictory tendency that, as noted historian David Bryan Davis has observed, hails emancipation on the one hand as a glorious moment of national rebirth that proved in many ways to be a failure. Just months after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, a correspondent for an African-American newspaper in California criticized it as a halfway measure that applied only to areas beyond the reach of federal authority and continued to allow slavery in states or portions of states that remained loyal to the Union. Frustrated by the lack of progress towards full equality, Frederick Douglass declared in 1888 that the so-called emancipation was a stupendous fraud and practically a lie. Even though Ball's monument suggests that the Emancipation Proclamation settled the issue of slavery once and for all, and freedom was a gift Lincoln bestowed upon the enslaved, the idealized slave kneeling at Lincoln's feet is at odds with the nearly 200,000 black men who took up arms to secure their freedom, and also the black voices, many of which you'll find in our book, who criticized Lincoln during his presidency and exhorted him to take action against slavery and on behalf of racial equality. So our goal has been to present a wide array of documents that reflect these various points of view. And it has not been to either valorize or demonize Lincoln. So there are many monuments to Lincoln. You've seen some in Cincinnati, made of bronze or marble. And our book includes speeches that were made to help dedicate some of those monuments. But the voices we have assembled in this volume, we like to think of as a scaffolding to a very different type of Lincoln monument. The words in our volume offer a fluid, wide-ranging, and complex monument that spans over 150 years, from 1858 to 2009. Okay, now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my favorite people and documents in here. And this first one is from Alexander Augusta, so you have his portrait there, and you also have an image of a letter that he wrote to Lincoln just days after Lincoln issued the final Emancipation Proclamation. And Augusta was born in the United States, but he wrote to Lincoln from Toronto, Canada, because Augusta had to go to Canada in order to attend medical school. No medical school in the United States would accept him. And after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it included a call for black men to serve. And Augusta was ready to serve. And that's what he writes to Lincoln. And so Augusta was invited to come to the War Department in Washington and be examined to be a surgeon in the Army. And when he showed up, the examiners weren't expecting him to look the way he looked. And he was initially denied the opportunity to take the exam to become a surgeon. But he persisted. And he was finally given his examination. And he later wrote that he thought they gave him the hardest examination that they possibly could, but he passed. And by virtue of being a surgeon in the Army, he was commissioned a major. And you can see in his photo, he's wearing his officer's jacket that have the shoulder straps denoting the rank of a major in the Army. Well, no one had ever seen this before. And when Augusta was riding a train between Baltimore and Washington, he was assaulted because a group of thugs did not think that a black man could possibly be a major in the United States Army. And Augusta also encountered trouble riding the streetcars in Washington. And this comes to the attention of Congress and President Lincoln, and Congress passed a bill that President Lincoln signed into law that prohibited discrimination on the Washington, D.C. streetcars. And Augusta took advantage of a new policy that President Lincoln had enacted that welcomed people of all races to White House receptions. So in 1864, Augusta had the opportunity to meet Lincoln at the White House and shake his hand. So Augusta thought very highly of Lincoln, but we have examples in our book of soldiers who didn't think so highly of Lincoln. And one of my favorite is a soldier from the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. And he wrote a series of letters to an African-American newspaper in New York just prior to the 1864 presidential election. So Lincoln is seeking re-election, a second term in office, and this soldier writes, Mr. Lincoln's policy in regard to the elevation and inseparability of the Negro race has always been one of a fickle-minded man, one who, holding anti-slavery principles in one hand and colonization in the other, always gave concessions to slavery when the Union could be preserved without touching the peculiar institution. Such a man is not again worthy the votes of the voting portion of the colored race. Now, a very different point of view comes from Osborne Anderson, and Osborne Anderson was the only African-American in John Brown's army who survived. He got away, wrote a book about his experiences, and gave a speech in Chicago to commemorate the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. And in this speech, Osborne Anderson says that Lincoln's proclamation was nothing less than the greatest event in the history of the United States that vindicated the principles for which John Brown had given his life. Another point of view comes from Amos Beeman, and he was a Congregationalist minister. And in 1864, he spoke at a commemoration of the first anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. And he praised Lincoln, but he also noted that the president was far from being a perfect man in the science of human freedom. For Beeman saw no proof that Lincoln accepted the idea of the perfect equality and equal brotherhood of the whole human race. So Beeman had a divided heart. And this divided heart, I think, mirrors a larger trend in African-American memory of Lincoln. As Quarles suggests in his book, Lincoln and the Negro, Lincoln became Lincoln because of black people. African-American commemoration of Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation played a vital role in shaping Lincoln's image. Much had happened in the century between John Proctor's letter to Lincoln and the publication of Bennett's scathing article. But it would be an oversimplification to assume that African-American views on Lincoln have followed a straight-line trajectory that went from uncritical adulation in the 1860s to bitter disillusionment by the 1960s. The words collected in Knowing Him by Heart reveal a complex diversity of thoughts and feelings about Lincoln and the meaning of emancipation. Ever since Lincoln came to the forefront on the national political stage, African Americans have expressed a variety of opinions about him and his perceived commitment to freedom and equality. In the century that followed Lincoln's death, African Americans grappled with Lincoln's legacy, and the memory of the Emancipation Proclamation figured prominently in creating a usable past to advance the cause of racial equality. So clearly, African Americans knew Lincoln by heart, but Lincoln's place in black memory reflected a variety of hopes, fears, aspirations, and frustrations that frequently led to these hearts being divided. So this is George LaVere, and as a consequence of the Emancipation Proclamation, the opportunity for black men to serve as soldiers. And then at the end of his life, Lincoln publicly suggested that at least some black men should have voting rights. When Lincoln was assassinated just days after he made that suggestion, it prompted an outpouring of grief from the African American community. And George LaVere was a chaplain in the 20th U.S. Colored Infantry. And in his eulogy of Lincoln, LaVere praised him as a truly great man committed to justice and right. And LaVere urged his listeners to go home and write the name of Abraham Lincoln in their Bibles and pass them down to succeeding generations. So in doing that, LaVere, I think, was suggesting that Lincoln should be remembered as essentially a member of all black families. So shortly after Lincoln's death, Frederick Douglass began to compose a speech on the assassination and the lessons it taught the American people. And in this speech, Douglass argues that Lincoln was the first president who rose above the prejudices of his time and his country. Douglass believed that Lincoln's views on racial equality had progressed to such an extent that if he had lived, if he were alive in 1866, he would support equal voting rights for black people. And Douglass concluded that Lincoln's death was therefore what he called an unspeakable calamity to persons of color in particular. Douglass was convinced that if Mr. Lincoln had lived, we might have looked for still greater progress. Learning wisdom by war, he would have learned even more from peace. So if Lincoln's legacy represented freedom and the prospect of racial equality to black people, for some, whoops, what's going on? I think I got the wrong, is this the right slide? It is. I added something for the local audience, okay? I added something for the local audience. This is from a group that was formed shortly after Lincoln's assassination in Cincinnati, to commemorate Lincoln's birthday every year. Okay? And so African Americans were in the forefront of celebrating Lincoln's birthday. And this Lincoln Memorial Club met every year in Cincinnati on the anniversary of Lincoln's birth. And I found in the pages of the Cincinnati Enquirer reports of all of their meetings. And so we included one of the speeches that a fellow gave in 1873. His name was Thomas Liverpool. And Thomas Liverpool thought very highly of Lincoln because Liverpool not only praised the Emancipation Proclamation, but he thought that this was a particularly great act because, in his words, Lincoln freed what Liverpool called an alien race. An alien race. And then what you see on the slide is that the following year, in 1874, the Lincoln Memorial Club in Cincinnati sent a petition to Congress urging them to make Lincoln's birthday a national holiday. That didn't happen, by the way, but they tried. Okay. So if Lincoln's legacy represented freedom and the prospect of racial equality to African Americans, for some white Southerners, Lincoln symbolized a savior of a very different sort. So according to Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, and others, Lincoln's untimely death was a tragedy because they believed Lincoln would have saved the South from the evils of so-called radical Reconstruction. Stephens was the former rebel vice president, and in a speech in 1878, he claimed that the assassination was the spring from which afterward came unnumbered woes. A Confederate veteran maintained that Lincoln's death was nothing less than another Gettysburg to the South. And Stephens also claimed that Lincoln had issued the Emancipation Proclamation as strictly a war measure and not out of any humanitarian concern for the enslaved people. And so in 1890, a group of Southern members of Congress got together and they published a volume of essays called Why the Solid South? And these essays make it clear that the history of Reconstruction demonstrated the folly of federal interference in the domestic affairs of the southern states. And Hillary Herbert, whose photograph you see on the slide, he was a member of the U.S. House from Alabama, and he had put this volume together. And in his essay on Reconstruction in Alabama, he referred to Lincoln's death as an appalling calamity for white Southerners, because he believed that Lincoln never would have allowed Congress to force the disastrous policies of black civil and political rights upon the former Confederate states. So in making the case against federal meddling with race relations, the essayists appealed directly to what one of them termed the tender patriot heart of Lincoln to make sure the alleged mistakes of Reconstruction were not repeated. Okay. So what was in Lincoln's heart? Did he possess a black heart that identified with the plight of African Americans and was genuinely committed to racial equality? Or was it a white heart that gave little consideration to black people and placed the interests of white Americans first? And what strikes me is that Lerone Bennett has something in common with the white Southern novelist Thomas Dixon when it comes to this question. So just as Bennett's Lincoln was unable to transcend the racism of his era or abandon his plans for colonization, Dixon published a novel in 1913, the semi-centennial anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And this novel is called The Southerner, a romance of the real Lincoln. And in this novel, Dixon depicts Lincoln as a true friend of white Southerners. And Dixon speculates that if Lincoln had lived to complete his second term, he would have deported all of the black veterans to Central America, where they would have worked on digging the Panama Canal. And so Dixon's Lincoln realized the foolishness of the radical Republican plan for a biracial democracy. The black abolitionist Peter Clark, who also spent some time in Cincinnati, was also a harsh critic of Lincoln, and he anticipated much of Bennett's criticism by over 75 years when he wrote that the Emancipation Proclamation was merely a necessity forced from the unwilling hand of Lincoln. According to Clark, Lincoln viewed the conflict as a white man's war and considered issues only from the standpoint of the white man's interests. For Lincoln, preservation of the Union was paramount, and he represented a white constituency that was both anti-slavery and anti-Negro. Clark was not alone in thinking Lincoln possessed a white heart, as evidenced by a wide variety of opinions on Lincoln that were produced during the centennial year of his birth in 1909. John M. Gandy was a college professor in Virginia, and he argued that Lincoln, quote, loved the Union more than he did either white or black men, and the Emancipation Proclamation was merely the result of military necessity. Gandy also pointed out that Lincoln favored colonization and denied political and social equality to the Negro race, on the ground that the great physical differences between the races would never allow it. Nevertheless, Gandy also noted that Lincoln possessed the courage to claim that black people were entitled to natural rights under the Declaration of Independence, and that this opened what he called a door of opportunity. But African Americans were still waiting for full equal rights in 1909, and Gandy was pessimistic that natural rights would be recognized and preserved without political and civil rights. While some preferred a more ambivalent Lincoln, many African Americans did embrace an unambiguously heroic image of Lincoln as a martyr and great emancipator. At a centennial commemoration of Lincoln's birth in Springfield, Illinois, James McGee asserted that black people loved Lincoln, and with the sole exception of Jesus Christ, he was the greatest man who ever lived. Booker T. Washington considered Lincoln the emancipator of his race and claimed that the people Lincoln freed owed him what Washington called a debt of gratitude. And Washington repeated this theme in several speeches at various Lincoln events, where he sought to prove that black economic advancements had vindicated Lincoln's decision. George Henderson was a dean at Fisk University, and he reasoned that Lincoln was in the same league as Moses, and perhaps even greater, because Lincoln freed a race that was of a different skin color than his own. Henderson dismissed the claim that the Emancipation Proclamation was merely the result of military necessity and instead focused on the growth that Lincoln exhibited during his career. Lincoln was, in Henderson's view, the first public man of note to suggest Negro citizenship, and he used his skill as a statesman to impress upon the country the profound convictions of his heart. So, as historian David Blight argues in a very important book on the memory of the Civil War, by the early 20th century, many white Americans ignored the consequences that resulted from the unfinished work of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and this was done in the interest of healing the wounds of the Civil War. Reconciliation between North and South became the order of the day. Many Southern whites were willing, though perhaps somewhat grudgingly, to recognize Lincoln's greatness in exchange for non-interference in their domestic affairs and an acknowledgement that so-called radical Reconstruction had been a mistake. Many white people in the North increasingly accepted this bargain by turning a blind eye to disfranchisement, segregation, and lynching. When President Theodore Roosevelt spoke at the centennial commemoration of Lincoln's birth, held at Hodgenville, Kentucky, he shared the podium with his Secretary of War, who was a veteran of the rebel army, if you could believe that, serving as Secretary of War in 1909. And in his speech, the Secretary of War praised Lincoln for his lack of animosity towards white Southerners and asserted that Lincoln would have saved the South from the evils of radical Republicans during Reconstruction, and thereby would have performed a great service to both white people and black people. It's clear then that Lincoln's legacy could serve as a bridge to sectional reconciliation that minimized the significance of emancipation and the unfinished work of racial equality. And I think few things better epitomize this trend than when the editor of a leading black periodical, the Colored American magazine, observed during the Lincoln Centennial that while an increasing number of white people were now following the lead of black people in celebrating Lincoln's birthday, black people were conspicuously unwelcome at many of these events. Booker T. Washington had been unable to accept an invitation to participate in the Lincoln Centennial Association's banquet held in Springfield on February 12, 1909, yet he was evidently the only black person who was welcome to attend. Springfield's African-American community therefore organized their own celebration, and in his speech at the occasion, James McGee criticized the hypocrisy of the Lincoln Centennial Association and concluded that he would rather pay tribute to what he called the sacred dust in Lincoln's tomb than pay the $25 to attend the banquet. African Americans therefore rejected reconciliationist efforts to celebrate Lincoln without also commemorating the significance of emancipation. And some invoked Lincoln's memory for the purpose of pointing out how the nation was failing to uphold his principles. To mark the 50th anniversary of the final Emancipation Proclamation, W.E.B. Du Bois delivered an address at a large event held in Chicago, where he worried that the country was drifting towards oligarchy since Southern states had systematically deprived black men of their voting rights. Du Bois argued that the nation must honor Lincoln's legacy by making what he said, quote, democracy effective in America. In the wake of a large blue-gray reunion, they would have these reunions where Union and Confederate veterans would get together and swap stories, and they did a big one in Gettysburg in 1913. And in response to this, the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper lamented that with the exception of the abolition of slavery, the South had gained everything it had fought for during the Civil War. The Afro-American doubted Lincoln ever imagined that his famous phrase, of the people, by the people, for the people, from the Gettysburg Address, would be interpreted as applying only to white people. The Cleveland Gazette, another African-American newspaper, was equally appalled by what it called the silly and hypocritical fawning that places on equality the wearers of the blue and the gray. The work of emancipation was being undone, and as long as sectional reconciliation prevailed, the South would be allowed to continue its campaign of what the Gazette termed anti-Negro warfare. The Gazette therefore called for a second emancipation. As monuments to the defeated rebellion increasingly dotted the landscape in the South, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington was dedicated as a symbol of sectional reconciliation, and it was dedicated just over a century ago in 1922 before an audience that was racially segregated. Virtually ignoring Lincoln's role as great emancipator, the monument instead burnished his image as savior of the Union. And this was despite the efforts of Robert Moton. Moton had succeeded Booker T. Washington as president of the Tuskegee Institute, and he was the lone African-American speaker at the dedication ceremony. In a draft of Moton's speech, he asserted that the task of emancipation remained incomplete, and the monument to Lincoln was what he called a hollow mockery, a symbol of hypocrisy, unless we together can make real in our national life, in every state and in every section, the things for which Lincoln died. But in the version he actually delivered at the dedication ceremony, Moton instead stated that Lincoln had not died in vain because the hearts of Americans, both North and South, were devoted to healing the wounds of war and restoring the Union. Moton's revised speech was more in accordance with the reconciliationist message of the monument and its dedication, which featured veterans, again, from both sides of the war. If you can imagine Confederate veterans attending the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. For former President and current Chief Justice William Howard Taft, I told you he'd make a cameo, and here he is. He was chairman of the Lincoln Memorial Commission. And in his speech, he said that the monument to Lincoln represented what he called the restoration of the brotherly love between North and South. So if you've ever had a chance to visit the Lincoln Memorial, or of course you've seen photos of it, when you go inside you see this wonderful statue of Lincoln by Daniel Chester French, and then above him are these words. And it's clear, right? These words were written with a purpose, and that purpose was to commemorate Lincoln as the savior of the Union and not as the great emancipator. And so the designers of the memorial purposely avoided direct references to emancipation. But that did not stop one of the leading poets of the Harlem Renaissance. This is Georgia Douglas Johnson. And she was a resident of Washington, D.C., so she could see the memorial as it was being constructed. And she published this very short poem in tribute to Lincoln the same year that the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated. And it's clear that she takes those words that were in the memorial and refashions them in such a way to make it clear that African Americans are included, and that their hearts would always revere the memory of President Lincoln. So in response to the Lincoln Memorial's dedication, W.E.B. Du Bois pursued a different course than Johnson when he published a very short piece in the monthly magazine of the NAACP, of which Du Bois was the editor. And in this piece, he described Lincoln as a poor, ill-educated, ugly, an awkward Southern white boy, a consummate politician. Yet Douglas also wrote that there was something big inside of Lincoln and concluded that Lincoln was big enough to be inconsistent. Lincoln, in Du Bois's view, both despised black people and favored their citizenship, protected slavery, and freed slaves. When this was published, Du Bois angered so many readers of the magazine that he had to issue an apology a few months later. But in this apology, he made it clear that he loved Lincoln. And the reason why he loved Lincoln is because he was a human being, and imperfect as all human beings are. So less than a year after the Lincoln Memorial was dedicated, the U.S. Senate approved a loyal slave monument that would have been erected not far from where the Lincoln Memorial is located. That same year, a group of Southern senators successfully filibustered a bill that would have made it a federal crime to participate in a lynching. So for a woman named M. Kravitz Simpson, this was an atrocity. She was active in an organization called the National Association of Colored Women. And she gave a speech in February 1923 to commemorate both the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And the NACW had sent a delegation to meet with President Harding to lobby for this anti-lynching bill that got filibustered in the Senate. They were a little bit more successful, though, in their efforts to kill this loyal slave monument that would have gone up in Washington, if you can imagine that. But in this speech, which I think is again, you're getting kind of the highlights, some of my favorite documents in the book, and this is one of my very favorites. She expresses her wish that Lincoln were alive in the 1920s. Her wish that such a man as Abraham Lincoln stood today at the head of affairs in Washington. And why? Because she believed Lincoln would make the Congress know that while they had closed their eyes to the Constitution of the United States and will not enforce its laws, the Declaration of Independence still stands. And she was clearly concerned by the recent resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan and the failure of Congress to approve this anti-lynching bill. But Simpson believed that if leaders in Washington simply enforced Lincoln's interpretation of the Declaration of Independence, true equality could be achieved. So a half century after the Cleveland Gazette urged the necessity of a second emancipation, another leading black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, editorialized that the task of emancipation remained unfinished, since equality and democracy had not yet been fully achieved. The centennial of the Emancipation Proclamation occurred at a time of increasing frustration over this lack of progress. And while an effort was made to mark the 100th anniversary of emancipation, some African Americans concluded that there was little to celebrate. Martin Luther King Jr., however, took issue with those who believed the Emancipation Proclamation was not worthy of commemoration. And we have in our book a speech, not a particularly well-known speech, but I think a very good speech, an important speech that King gave in September 1962 at the New York Emancipation Proclamation Centennial Observance. And in this speech, King emphasizes what he calls the positive results of Lincoln's proclamation. And he defends Lincoln against charges that the proclamation was a hallowed pronouncement from an opportunistic politician. Though Lincoln's heart was tortured by the race question, the Emancipation Proclamation, in King's view, deserved to live in what he called sacred honor. And King argued that the best way to commemorate Lincoln's proclamation was to finally make its Declaration of Freedom real. So King urged President Kennedy to issue a second Emancipation Proclamation that would prohibit racial discrimination. And his address, the very famous address that he gave at the Lincoln Memorial in August 1963, begins by paying tribute to Lincoln and the centennial anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. Yet the thrust of his argument was that 100 years later, African Americans were still not free. That same year, Malcolm X rejected the view that Lincoln was a god who brought us out of slavery, and he dismissed the Emancipation Proclamation as insignificant. If the original proclamation had been authentic, Malcolm reasoned that King wouldn't have to be begging for another proclamation today. Julius Lester condemned the notion that black people should be grateful because Lincoln freed them, And he called this, quote, one of the bigger lies that America has given the world. In Lester's view, Lincoln did not issue the proclamation out of the goodness of his heart, and instead of praising him, black people should be angry with him for waiting so long to take action against slavery. Lerone Bennett's essay, then, in Ebony in February 1968 was therefore one of several disillusioned and angry voices in the 1960s. Bennett's provocative choice of words struck a chord at a time when many were fed up with a lack of progress since 1863. Lincoln proved a convenient target for this frustration, but Bennett should not be seen as the lone representative voice from the 1960s. This decade also witnessed the publication of distinguished books on Lincoln by John Hope Franklin and Benjamin Quarles, both prominent scholars who offered more measured assessments. Franklin acknowledged the Emancipation Proclamation as what he called a great American document of freedom, even though its promise had not yet been fully met. The differences between Franklin and Bennett are simply another example of a trend that the Baltimore Afro-American identified in 1922. Following the controversial dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, the Afro-American observed, quote, there always has been and there always will be differences of opinion among black people on Abraham Lincoln. And I don't think a consensus is likely anytime soon regarding what was in Lincoln's heart. And though African Americans have long known Lincoln by heart, these hearts have always been divided. And so I'll conclude with the image that's on the cover of our book. And this shows a period illustration of Lincoln's visit to Richmond, Virginia on April 4, 1865. So the capital of the so-called Confederacy had fallen the day before. And the first troops to occupy Richmond were African-American troops. And Lincoln made this, no president would get away with this today, I don't think, with the Secret Service, but he made a spontaneous decision to visit Richmond. And so this was unannounced, there was no prior publicity, and when Lincoln's boat landed at the dock in Richmond, you can see what happened in this illustration. The African-American residents of Richmond soon began talking about how the president was visiting. And at first they thought, well, wait, is this Jefferson Davis? If so, we're going to go hide. But no, it's Lincoln. And they crowded around him, wanting to see him, wanting to meet him. And we have 3 accounts of this in our book. 2 are from soldiers who were there, and 1 is from a war correspondent. And I guess if I could go anywhere back in time, this would be one of my top choices, would be Richmond on April 4, 1865. So when you think about the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln's suggestion that African Americans were citizens, the enlistment of African Americans as soldiers that helped win the war, and the proposal at the end of his life that at least some black men should vote, these were all affronts to the idea that black people were inherently inferior and had been fortunate to be enslaved. And so Fred and I believe that the meanings of this iconic 16th president crossing paths with people whose ascribed status was lower than the lowliest of white people at the time, this remains evasive and contested. Yet we hope that the documents and knowing him by heart will afford readers an opportunity to examine this relationship in greater depth and explore how it has developed over the past 150 years. So our hope is that this book contributes to and invigorates a dialogue that furthers greater understanding of past and present race relations in our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I had skimmed the book before, but it's quite dense.
It's big.
And you can read it in parts. You don't have to read the whole thing at once.
You can
right?
dip into it. Yeah, it's not meant to be read cover to cover. You can dip into it.
Yes.
You can see why it took us over a decade to put it together.
Yes,
right?
definitely.
Yeah.
So we will entertain questions. If anyone has a question, raise your hand. I'll come bring you the microphone so that the people online can hear as well. And if you're online, just type your question into the chat. We'll start here with Jan and then Fred.
I was wondering how your book has been received. I know if you say Black Americans or African Americans, it's a large group, but have you had reviews from different people that would give you any indication?
There's a great political scientist and Lincoln scholar named Lucas Morrell, who's African American, who wrote a very nice review of our book. And I did an event in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania last November, and during the Q&A, an African American man got up and he said, "I've already bought 5 copies of your book, and I'm going to buy some more while I'm here." So I don't know if that, again, that's just two people. So what limited evidence I have has been pretty encouraging so far. Yeah.
My question was concerning the speech that you referenced by a man named Moten.
Robert Moten, yes.
How is it that you were able to know what he originally wrote and then what he actually delivered? That seems like a detective story.
Yes, that's a great story. Moten's papers are at the Library of Congress, so we looked at them. But we knew there's a fair amount of mythology around the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. And so there are stories that claim that Moten was forced to sit by himself, which isn't true. And there's also stories that our friend Taft forced him to change his speech. And so, yeah, I mean, historians are kind of detectives at heart. And so I wanted to get to the bottom of this because this is a really important speech that we wanted to include in the book. And so I looked in Moten's papers, and I also looked in the Taft papers, which are also at the Library of Congress. And there's correspondence between Taft and Moten. Taft invites Moten to speak, and he says to Moten, "I need to see an advance copy of your speech because there's a strict 15-minute time limit and you can't go over." So Moten sends him a copy of the speech, and Taft responds when he sees these words, that the memorial's a hypocrisy and a hollow mockery until we live up to Lincoln's ideals. And Taft writes to Moten, and he says, this is a dedication ceremony. This is not an activist occasion. And Moten responds by writing and saying, "I know exactly what you mean. I've already started to change my speech." Okay? So I don't think it's true that Taft forced Moten to change his speech, but he suggested it, and according to Moten's response, he was already working on revising it. So in our book, you get both versions. You get the version that that Moten originally drafted, and then you get the final version, so you can kind of compare and see how they differ. And there are very substantial differences between them.
Other questions?
I guess I really already knew this, but people using the same set of circumstances and facts to advance their own agenda,
Yes.
is not a new phenomenon.
No.
And I learned that from you. You reinforced that today.
Yeah.
Can you tell me, in that vein, what was most surprising to you in your research, maybe you included in the book or didn't include in the book, about people using the same set of circumstances to advance their own agenda?
Sure. That's something that really struck out to us, is this idea of kind of crafting a usable past. And so you will see examples, like I talked about today, of people trying to make Lincoln into a great hero and champion of racial equality. And so the size of the book might make you think otherwise, but we did not include everything that we found. And the most surprising thing I think that we found was just how much material there is. That we knew that we would find a lot, but we found even more than we expected. And so what we did not include everything, but what we tried to do was to include representative examples. So you'll have representative examples of people who think that Lincoln is Moses, is Father Abraham, is the great emancipator. But then we also include examples of people who were very critical of Lincoln. because our goal was not to make Lincoln look good or to make him look bad. It was to show just how deep, rich, and complex all of these different voices have been over the last 150 years. So I think that was what was most surprising, was there was this kind of preconception that I think a lot of people had, was that black people really liked Lincoln during the Civil War and then didn't like him by the 1960s. And what we found is that there were plenty of people who didn't like Lincoln in the 1860s and in the 1880s, in the 1890s, and the early 1900s. And when you get to the 1960s, sure, there's Lerone Bennett and there's Malcolm X and Julius Lester, and they're very critical, but there are also people like Edith Sampson, who I didn't talk about in the speech today, but she was a federal judge, and she's involved in commemorating the Emancipation Proclamation. Thurgood Marshall gave an interesting speech at the Lincoln Memorial in 1962, King's speech from 1962. So to me, it just shows just how complex all of this is. And like I tell students, that's why I like history. History is complicated and it's messy, and that's not what keeps me up at night, right? I'm perfectly comfortable with history being messy and complicated.
Coming over here.
Hi.
Hi.
Until the last statement where you mentioned Edith,
Yes.
I heard no women.
M. Kravitz Simpson is a woman, or was a woman, and I talked about her in her speech in February 1923. We also have, we made a concerted effort to get as many women in the book as possible. So you'll find Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was a very well-known poet. We have one of her poems, and we also have a speech from her. Fred and I spent a lot of time trying to find something from Ida B. Wells, the anti-lynching crusader, and I finally found something. I don't think anyone else knew about this, but she was invited to speak in Decatur, Illinois at an emancipation event. And so we have the speech from her in there. Edith Sampson is in there. We have a poem from Gwendolyn Brooks from 1965, which was commissioned for a Lincoln Civil War centennial event. And Fred is a poet. It was kind of interesting because Fred personally knew Gwendolyn Brooks, but Fred didn't know about this poem because it's not included in any of the standard anthologies of her works. So it's kind of interesting that it kind of got left out, and we've brought it back. So you will find that we do have women in the book. Yeah, I didn't, and in the interest of time, I thought I maybe talked a little bit too long as it was.
But never exclude the women.
We also have Elizabeth Keckley, and Elizabeth Keckley was Mrs. Lincoln's dressmaker, and they became very close friends until Keckley wrote a book, kind of an expose of what life was like at the White House. And so we have excerpts from that book, which is called Behind the Scenes. And then near the end of the project, I found an interview that Keckley gave shortly before her death, where she's asked about Lincoln, and she says, and even though Keckley had been enslaved, she had purchased her freedom, so she was not freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. But she says in this interview, the only people who will really ever understand Lincoln and the significance of the Emancipation Proclamation are those people who have been enslaved.
Yes, but I also find that women have their finger on the pulse, and they tend to get in spaces and are able to make observations that others may not have opportunities to do. I'm a member of a sorority that was founded in 1913, and our first act of community service was to walk in the women's suffrage march. Mm-hmm. So I would be very interested to hear what their thoughts were about Mr. Lincoln. I'm sure they had some.
We have an item from a fraternal, or it's a women's organization in New York, and they did this piece right before a referendum in New York on women's suffrage. And they kind of misquote a letter that Lincoln wrote early in his political career where Lincoln had indicated his support for women's suffrage. But their point, and this is another example of crafting this usable past, where they say, you know, New York is about to vote on this important referendum. And here's what Lincoln thought. And Lincoln was in favor of it. So, men, you should be in favor of it. Go out and vote for it.
Fred's got another question. Hang on, I'm coming.
Well, this is not really a question. I just wanted to congratulate you on including Peter Clark.
Okay.
Because I believe he has a connection to this congregation.
Oh, to the congregation even,
I
interesting.
can't speak to it because I'm not a member, but I'm sure there's someone here who could, but
He's there's a biography of him. He's a very interesting fellow. And yeah, I found this piece that he wrote in the 1890s about very critical of Lincoln and saying that the Emancipation Proclamation was forced from him, which is an interesting parallel to what Bennett argues in his 1968 piece.
Harry Beecher Stowe was instrumental in forcing it out of Mr. Lincoln.
All right. Anything else? Well, again, we want to thank Professor Norman for his discussion today. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. And as we reopen in July, we will have some copies of the book in our museum shop as well. So I just wanted to let you know that. And we'll go ahead and sign off for the afternoon. There are some snacks out in the lobby. We'll hang out and still chit-chat a little bit if you are interested. But thank you all for coming today.